There is a garden plot that has not grown anything useful in 3 years. The soil is pale, almost gray, compacted so hard that a finger pressed into it leaves almost no mark. Nothing planted there survives past the seedling stage. Experienced gardeners have looked at it and shaken their heads. A soil test came back with numbers so poor that the person who ran it suggested starting over completely with imported topsoil. Hundreds of dollars, weeks of labor, total replacement. And then someone walked over with a glass jar full of something that looked like coarse white powder, worked it into the top few inches of that dead soil, and left. 6 weeks later, that same plot had earthworms in it. Earthworms that had not been there in years. The soil had changed color, darkened slightly, become easier to press into, and by the end of the season it was growing tomatoes so productive that the neighbors could not explain what they were seeing. The powder in that jar cost nothing. It came from the kitchen. It had been accumulating in a container on the counter for 2 months, ground up with a rolling pin, dried overnight, and it contained something that the soil amendment industry charges serious money to replicate in a bag with a scientific-sounding name on the front. What you are about to learn is not a gardening trick. It is a window into a relationship between organic waste and living soil that pre-industrial cultures understood intuitively and that modern agriculture buried under decades of manufactured dependency. Once you see it clearly, you will not be able to unsee it. Eggshells. That is what was in the jar. Ground eggshells. The thing you crack open every morning, rinse off without thinking, and drop into the trash without a second glance. And the reason they transformed that dead soil into something alive and productive is not magic. It is chemistry, biology, and physics working together in a way that most people have never been told about, because once again, the most effective solution turns out to be the least profitable one. Here is what makes this remarkable. Eggshells are composed of approximately 94% calcium carbonate. That is the same core compound found in agricultural lime, which is one of the most widely used and most commercially successful soil amendment products in the world. Farmers and gardeners spend enormous amounts of money every year purchasing lime to correct soil pH, to introduce calcium into depleted ground, and to improve the structural conditions that allow beneficial microorganisms to thrive. And every morning, in hundreds of millions of kitchens across the world, people are throwing the functional equivalent of that product directly into the trash. The eggshell sitting in your bin right now is not waste. It is a soil amendment that has already been processed, packaged, and delivered to you at zero additional cost, bundled into something you were going to buy for breakfast anyway. This method is not obscure or unproven. Organic farms in South Korea have formalized eggshell application into their soil management protocols. Community gardens across the Netherlands and Scandinavia use collected eggshells as a primary calcium source in their composting systems. Small-scale farmers in parts of rural Mexico and Guatemala have been grinding shells into their planting soil for generations, a practice passed down not through agricultural manuals, but through direct family knowledge that never required a product label to validate it. The knowledge exists, it has always existed, it just does not have a marketing department, and that is the question worth asking directly. Why is this not common knowledge? Why is the first thing every gardening article recommends when someone describes depleted, acidic, or structurally dead soil, a bag of lime, or a commercial calcium supplement? The answer is not complicated once you stop expecting it to be. The soil amendment market is worth tens of billions of dollars globally. Calcium carbonate in a branded bag with application instructions on the back is a product. Calcium carbonate in the eggshell from your breakfast is invisible to that market. There is no mechanism for an industry to profit from something you already own and would otherwise discard, so the conversation never gets steered toward it. The recommendation is always toward the shelf, always toward the purchase, not because the purchase is more effective, but because effectiveness was never the only variable being optimized. You have experienced the downstream result of this your whole life. Every time a soil problem was framed as something requiring a product to fix, every time a dead garden bed was treated as a deficiency that money could solve. The soil under your feet is a living ecosystem that has been managing itself for hundreds of millions of years, and it has specific, well-understood needs that can be met in multiple ways. The industry wants you to believe those needs can only be met through their channel. The eggshell on your counter is the simplest possible proof that they are wrong. Now let's get into the actual science, because understanding the mechanism is what makes this knowledge stick and what allows you to use it strategically rather than just blindly following a step. Soil pH is the single most important variable in whether a garden thrives or fails. Most food crops need a pH range between 6 and 7 to access the nutrients already present in the soil. Slightly acidic to neutral. When soil becomes too acidic, which happens naturally over time through rainfall, organic decomposition, and the use of high nitrogen fertilizers, it crosses below that range and something critical happens. The nutrients do not disappear. They are still physically present in the soil, but they become chemically locked, bound into compounds that plant roots cannot access. You can add all the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium you want to acidic soil and see almost no result, because the chemistry of the environment prevents the plant from using any of it. This is why gardens go dead, not usually from a lack of nutrients in the ground, but from a pH level that makes those nutrients biologically invisible to the plant. Calcium carbonate is alkaline. When it breaks down in soil, it neutralizes acidity by reacting with the hydrogen ions that are making the environment too hostile for plant uptake. It raises the pH back into the usable range. And when it does that, something that looks like magic happens. The nutrients that were already in the soil, the ones no product had been able to unlock, suddenly become available. Plants start feeding on a pantry that was there all along but had been chemically locked shut. The soil does not become more nutritious because you added eggshells. It becomes more accessible. That is a subtle distinction, but it is the one that explains the dramatic results people see. Calcium also has direct benefits beyond pH. It is an essential macronutrient in its own right, involved in cell wall construction in plants. Calcium-deficient plants show a characteristic symptom called blossom end rot, the dark sunken collapse of the bottom of tomatoes, peppers, and squash that ruins fruit and baffles gardeners who have been feeding their plants everything else. Eggshells address that deficiency at the source, and the physical structure of ground eggshell particles improves soil aeration and drainage in compacted ground, creating microscopic channels that water and air can move through, which is exactly the physical environment that earthworms and beneficial bacteria need to colonize an area and begin the biological work of soil restoration. Here is exactly how to use this, and simplicity is the point. Start saving eggshells immediately. Rinse them lightly after cracking, which removes the residual egg white that would otherwise rot and smell, and let them dry on a tray or windowsill for a day. Once dry, they can be stored in any container until you have a usable quantity. You do not need a precise amount to begin. Even a small batch applied consistently does cumulative work. The most effective preparation is grinding. Whole or roughly crushed shells break down very slowly in soil, over months or even years, and most of their benefit arrives too late to help the current growing season. Ground shells, reduced to a fine or medium powder using a blender, a food processor, a mortar and pestle, or even a rolling pin applied to shells in a sealed bag, break down within weeks and begin altering soil chemistry almost immediately. The finer the grind, the faster the effect. For established garden beds, work a generous layer of the ground powder into the top 2 to 3 inches of soil. Not sprinkled on the surface and left, actually incorporated, mixed into the physical structure of the soil where roots will be growing and where the chemistry matters. Do this at the beginning of the season and again at the midpoint. The change in soil texture and eventually in plant behavior will be measurable. For new plantings, add a tablespoon of ground shell to the bottom of each planting hole before setting in the seedling. This creates a localized pocket of calcium and adjusted pH directly in the zone where the roots will first establish themselves. It is a targeted delivery system that costs nothing and takes 15 additional seconds per plant. For seed starting, where young seedlings are most vulnerable to damping off fungus and pH-related stress, dust a light layer of finely ground shells across the surface of the starting mix and work it in lightly before sowing. This gives the seedlings a stable chemical environment from the very first root emergence. Here is what most people get wrong when they try this, because the mistakes are consistent and predictable and they cause people to abandon a method that would have worked if applied correctly. The biggest mistake is using whole or roughly broken shells and expecting fast results. A large shell fragment sitting on the surface of the soil may take 2 years to release meaningful amounts of calcium. It is not doing nothing, but it is doing almost nothing in the time frame that matters to a gardening season. Grinding is not optional if you want visible results. It is the step that determines whether this works in weeks or in years. The second mistake is single application thinking. People apply shells once, see some improvement, and stop. Soil chemistry is a dynamic system that continuously shifts with rainfall, organic decomposition, plant uptake, and seasonal cycles. Maintaining a healthy pH requires ongoing input, not a single correction. The third mistake is applying shells to soil that does not need pH correction. If your soil is already neutral or alkaline, adding calcium carbonate will push it toward alkalinity, which is actually harmful to the acid-loving plants many people grow. Test your soil first. A basic pH test kit costs almost nothing and tells you whether this is the right intervention before you apply it. The history here runs much deeper than most people realize, and it connects this practice to a pattern of agricultural intelligence that spans thousands of years across dozens of cultures. The practice of amending soil with ground shells, bone, and calcium-rich organic material is documented in agricultural records going back to ancient Rome. Roman agricultural writers, including Columella and Pliny the Elder, described the application of crushed shells and marl, a calcium-rich clay, to depleted farmland. They did not understand the chemistry of pH in the way we now do, but they observed the results with enough consistency to codify the practice and pass it forward. Medieval European farmers continued the practice of marling, spreading calcium-rich earth onto fields for centuries. The indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest used shell middens, the accumulated shells of shellfish harvested over generations, to create the famously productive garden beds documented by early European arrivals. The soil in those sites remains measurably different from surrounding land to this day. Higher calcium content, higher pH, richer biological activity. The shells did not decompose away into irrelevance, they became part of the soil's permanent identity. This is the thread that runs through all of it.